boom, boom, boom. You're getting this. You're getting this. Go buy. Get the best negotiation. Work with the Shmi in that department. Work with the Melanies of the world in the OR, and you were good to go. The last 3 years, this is completely switched. It's more alive and well, like weekly. I hear weekly discussions on capital improvement. Weekly. It used to be once a quarter, we'll get together, think about it. Or that year, we already knew what we were doing. We'll get together on a monthly basis. But now it's in our face every day, and I don't know if that's going to change for some time.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now it's time to roll back and start the first case.
As we kick off this season of the First Case podcast, Melanie, we're going to be talking to somebody I know very well, who is Gary Skinner. He's a partner at Discover S3 and the co-host of the Power Supply podcast, which he and I do together along with Hayes Waldrop. And you've gotten a chance to get to know Gary quite a bit as well, and said, hey, wait a second, if we're going to talk about capital equipment this season, shouldn't we get somebody to come in and talk about the finances of capital equipment? And that's how we find ourselves here today.
Look, I think it's so important to start with that part of the conversation. You can't get equipment if you don't have the money for it, and knowing where the money comes from or how those decisions are made, and even how that affects us as frontline staff and what our role is in making sure that our leadership knows what we need and voicing our concerns or the problems that we're having. All of that comes into play into making sure that we have the best equipment that we can possibly have so that we can give our patients the best care that they can possibly get. And Gary is just very knowledgeable about capital budgets and financing. And it's just going to be a really good, well-rounded conversation to really highlight this part of the capital equipment that we have in the OR.
Well, I'm looking forward to it, so don't go anywhere. Gary Skinner up next on the First Case podcast as we kick off this brand new season.
I'm Melanie Perry.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A 17 Studios production, you're listening to First Case.
With us now is Gary Skinner, partner at Discover S3 and co-host, actually with me, of the Power Supply podcast. So, Gary, you're in the family of podcasts along with First Case. For those out there that don't know, the Power Supply podcast covers healthcare supply chain, and that's why we've asked you to come join us and kick off this season of the First Case podcast, completely dedicated to capital equipment. And we're going to be telling everyone today about the capital budget and how to manage the capital budget and some important things related to capital equipment as we tee it up. Gary, thanks so much for coming on the show.
It's great. A little bit different little piece here. Love to be with you and Melanie here, and just honored to support it. So looking forward to the dialogue with the sister station, if you will.
Well, Gary, I know you pretty well, and I know your background, but why don't you tell all the listeners out there a little bit about yourself and, really your experience, because you've worn a lot of different hats in the industry.
Sure. I'll try to give you the Johnny Utah 2 and 2 real quick, 2 minutes and not go too long, but long story. I spent some time in the device world in the OR, in and out, did that for about 5 years. And then I made the transition over into supply chain. So I started, down in the OR, exchanging products, moving products and getting approval from the clinical teams and diving into that, and moved my way up to be a a chief resource officer and working with the senior leadership team, which I believe that's where I got a lot of my experience with the capital piece and owning that in multiple locations and being held accountable for that. The last 5 years, going on 5 years, Discover S3 is alive and well, and expense management in all categories, capital being one of those. So our own consulting with 2 other partners, Jeff Stevens, Nate Barker. Really excited. We've been working across the country. So it's been a good ride with that and enjoying the podcast world too with you, Justin. So thank you.
All right. So let's define the capital budget. I feel like most people have an idea of the capital budget, but sometimes it may just be, all right, I want to buy something and it's over X amount, and they're telling me that's the capital budget. Now I can't get it. I think that's the most common sort of scenario for how people become aware of a capital budget. But why don't we define it a little bit better? And even if you could talk about it in the context of, your supply chain working with maybe an OR business manager, perioperative director, how you all come together.
Yeah, that's a pretty big question. I first wanted to say what capital budget for 2023. It's been real difficult. It's a different world, Melanie. Right. You know that too.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's really, in my mind, it's those directors, those managers really coming to the table and working with our CFOs and what they need. What's the long-term strategy? Is it a 1-3? Is it a 5-year? Do we have an expansion in a cath lab? Do we have new doctors coming in, new surgeons that need new pieces of equipment to support them? Or it could be facilities-based, all the way to construction with IT. I'm not including break fix because that's kind of another discussion. But when we talk about expense budgets for capital, it's really putting it on the table of this is our wish list. This is what we think we need. And I think that goes through a whole pro forma ROI process with the CFO and a leadership team that really identifies, what's our dollars that we have available to distribute on, their fiscal year and what it looks like. I think it's a really good start from there. That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. What about, though, is there something maybe specific, or maybe it's determined specifically by each facility, but what level determines what's considered capital and what's just the money that we can spend as we need it? Is there a threshold for that?
It's a good question, Melanie. And I think you've got to almost break it apart, like from an ASC to a critical access to the larger systems. I think sometimes the larger systems, there's a corporate dollar, like we're going to give X amount of dollars to, a place in the Northwest versus the Northeast, and how big the level is. Is this a level 1 academic center, or is this a critical access hospital that's out in the middle of Wyoming or Montana? Something, I think it's the amount of dollars they need to really make things work. And the thresholds, I think, are important to identify too. What is really considered capital? Is it minor equipment up to 1,000? Is it up to 5,000? Is it up to 10,000? Where's the threshold where it obviously becomes a capital piece of equipment or a capital budget request?
So I think it's important to make that line of distinction that you just said is capital budget request versus capital equipment request. So you're talking like an MRI machine. Obviously, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. That one piece of equipment is a capital piece of equipment. But sometimes if that threshold is at like $5,000 and you're talking about a rigid scope, maybe there's some money that's under the capital budget for one rigid scope. But a lot of times you're talking about conversions, or even a power handpiece, Melanie, with your ortho background. One of those might be under the capital limit, but the budget itself, because you're typically going to make a big full conversion, all of a sudden that adds up and that becomes part of a capital expense. Can you talk about that a little bit, Gary?
Yeah, and I see where you're going too. And I think more along the lines of what you just discussed, you and Melanie are pointing out, is you've got to really think about the budget within what departments it hits as well. One piece of equipment may be this tangible item, but all of a sudden you've got maybe a facilities, a construction piece that falls into that budget. All of a sudden you've got an IT cost that falls into that budget. What's the service line look like with a clinical engineering biomed to cover after the OEM warranty goes away? So when you talk about budgets across the board and they're presenting this, they've got to include the other key stakeholders to really identify what the budget truly is, and not just the capital piece of equipment. It falls in line with those budgetary requests from a system-wide or a hospital as a whole when these are presented at the CFO level, because they're gonna look at it. They're gonna ask you all the questions when you go, almost like you're presenting to sell something, like a vendor almost. You're coming to the table with the CFO and the senior leadership team saying, we want this piece of equipment. Well, why? And have you done all your due diligence to really prepare the budget of what it looks like and what the cost implications are going to be year one, maybe into year 2, 3, and 4 down the road on the piece of capital that you're identifying you need for your certain department?
So how does a certain department get the favor of the CFO, I guess, to get the money? I mean, who gets it? How do they decide that?
So it's another really good question, Melanie. Melanie's got 2 good questions.
I'm winning. I'm getting the best new questions.
Are we running a tally?
Oh, we are.
So just to let everybody in on it, we do have a running tally amongst all the hosts of the Power Supply podcast on who gets the most good questions or great questions. So you're right, Melanie. You got me on this one. I just want you to know that Gary doesn't beat me on the other podcast.
No, Justin's a very good mentor. I'll just tell you that. So anyways, diving into this, I think you're looking at the table and you're like, I mean, I always go to surgery. I mean, surgery is our bread and butter. We all know that. Elective surgeries, getting them in there. If you're looking at capital equipment to support cases, to get patients there, to take care of those patients, to follow the mission, there's some pretty good ROI to justify a lot of that. I think they a lot of times have the front leading edge, especially to support part of that recruiting process for a lot of those surgeons coming in. You need that. You got to have that. You got to be ready. And that capital process starts on recruitment. It starts right there when you're trying to bring someone in to make sure they have it. So I think, first and foremost, you got to look at ROI that supports the mission and, the cath labs and the OR. But also you've got some infrastructure stuff that's coming down the road too. If you're expanding, you got to look at those capital pieces too that are being proposed. And I think that's when the strategy comes up and a true pro forma has to be submitted. And that takes some time. So that planning process could be happening from 6 to 9 months before we even get close to that calendar year, a year out, just to make sure we're moving forward. So I think it's the best presentation. What's it look like? What's the ROI? What are the needs of the hospital or the system, and what is the direction and strategy? And then you kind of identify that. And I think there's probably an elective group that sits at that board. In my experience, it's not just been one guy or one gal saying, this is it, you're going to get what? It's a group of people. It's the CNO, it's the CEO, it's the CFO, it's the key leadership individuals and supply chain at that table as well, helping support what those decisions are. And it may be put off till next year if it's not needed. And that's frustrating sometimes. So I think that's a good start.
Well, to follow on to that though, how does someone like me, OR manager, clinical person, make my case or plead my cause to a group of non-clinical people and get my voice heard?
Wow.
How am I supposed to do that?
That's that is game on. I love what you wrote right there. And seriously, you're the SME, we call it. You're the subject matter expert. You're about mission. You're about patients. And if it's patient critical, if it's patient safety, I think those are first and foremost at the top of the table. We got to take care of that and make sure we take care of what we're really doing, taking care of patients and being mission focused. But I think you collaborate. I think you work with supply chain hand in hand. Help us get the quote. Help us get with the vendors. Help us get the best costs we can. Is it on a GPO contract? What does this look like? And what does the service model look like? I think you help build your case with those key SMEs outside of your OR to follow your mission on what you need. I think there's a physician support as well, I think is key. Many times I've seen surgeons come to the table and have those dialogues with a med exec committee or a surgical committee or right in the CEO's office to talk about these are some of the needs that we have. And we're supporting Melanie down in the OR. I know she's asked about it, but here's some real true reasons why we need it. So I think it's building your case with the right people and leading that charge.
So I have a follow-up to that too, because a lot of times they'll set the capital, budget plan for the year. Like you said, they kick the can down the road. Maybe this is something that's going to be next year. And yet after the budget's approved, inevitably more budget dollars seem to come up for certain circumstances. What is the rationale behind when those dollars open up mid-year and something else got kicked down the road instead? And are we really sure that something that got kicked down the road is less important than the thing that's coming up mid-budget year?
Well, I just want to get break fix out of the way. I think we should talk about that first. There's certain things that come up that become priority now. We've got a cath lab that's on its end of life, it's end of useful life, and we need it fixed now. We've got a patient volume stacked 3 months, and we got to get going. We got to pull the trigger on that. So that money all of a sudden gets allocated, and it becomes the top of the list. We got to fix it now. It just happens, right? And so the break fix mentality, I think, is alive and well right now in 2023 with the limited amount of capital dollars we have because of where we've been in the red for the last couple of years with all the situations that have been hitting us. And I think to your point, and it's another great question, Justin, so it's 2-1, but to your point, break fix comes to the top. And then I think some of these other priorities, they come to the table. And I will say it, a lot of times you have surgeons that come in, or say you launch that surgeon that came in the middle of the year and he's ready to go. Melanie's not going to want to wait. She's like, I need that scope. We know what that's going to cost in the OR. Or, we need that different C-arm. We need that C-arm in OR number 7. And we need it like in a month. Exactly. And I meant to say microscope. But yeah, on the same page. And so some of those priorities switch, and then they, you kind of get knocked down on the level. And I think there's some contingency funding that's always left kind of on the table in the background, Justin. There's the break fix mentality, and then there's the contingency funding that they have. And you can kind of go to other resources and find other ways to pull dollars. If you're having a strong year, sometimes dollars show up. So
that's what I was getting at. You nailed what I was getting at. If the performance is going well, everybody's doing a great job of being efficient. There's less case delays. On time starts are doing great. We're not having cancellations. Like when the machine, I guess, the business of it is working really well, that does create additional dollars to continue investing. Is that how you would word that?
Absolutely. I think you're right on. And if you're having a good year, and hopefully that's where we're going right now. I think we're trending. Hopefully we've hit the bottom of the inflation, the bottom of the pandemic. We've hit, and we're growing back where we need to. Hopefully the labor force is coming back into play where we can structure an OR, right, Melanie? We've got nurses and first assists to help us, and personnel to flip these rooms and get our patients in there and get them taken care of. There's all these other pieces of this puzzle that feed into this capital. I mean, Justin, great point. What if you're in a cath lab expansion and you can't get people hired to support the cath lab? Something else might fall to the top of the list and go, we're delayed 6 months. Oh, OTO, over the ocean. We can't even get that piece of equipment. It's been delayed for another 6 months. Those are certain things that happen. And I think, like you said, it's a revolving wheel. It's a dartboard that I think is moving a little bit at a time. And I think it's a consistent message. I got a really good example. I'm working with a capital buyer right now, and we ping that individual weekly. Where are we at? Can we pull the trigger on this piece of equipment? And we keep asking and keep asking. And all of a sudden we find one piece of equipment that goes to the top, and all of a sudden we're getting closer. We know it's getting closer to being approved. It's because of delays on other things, or they decide to pull back on a service line delivery. So the moving dartboard, I think, is real, especially in the case we're at now. 5 to 10 years ago, this was different. You had an allotted dollar. You'd sit down with your team, Boom, boom, boom. You're getting this. You're getting this. Go buy, get the best negotiation, work with the SHME in that department, work with the Melanies of the world in the OR, and you were good to go. The last 3 years, this is completely switched. It's more alive and well, like weekly. I hear weekly discussions on capital improvement. Weekly. It used to be once a quarter, we'll get together, think about it. Or that year, we already knew what we were doing. We'll get together on a monthly basis. But now it's in our face every day, and I don't know if that's going to change for some time.
That's interesting that it has changed like that. I actually have a question about how some of our workarounds end up shooting us in the foot when it comes to our capital budgets, because like for me, I would interact with sterile processing a lot, our sterile processing team lead, when I would need new instruments for my sets. I couldn't get all the instruments for the sets, or I couldn't get a whole bunch done because it would go over the limit, whatever our threshold was. But I could get her to order me one a week. And then suddenly I could get what I needed, but it might take me time, but it would be approved because it was under that threshold. But doing that, now we all do it because we need our stuff, and we need our stuff working, and we need it to fill our trays or to whatever we need. But does that end up hurting us in the long run when it comes to having dollars available for those bigger purchases? Or is it just how we do things and that's just the normal way and how it goes?
Yeah, Melanie, I don't know if I've seen a lot of that with minor equipment. Your threshold's $2,500. I've seen thresholds of capital, by the way, at $1,000 and CFO approval. I mean, I've seen it. And if it's $950, it slides underneath, and you get one piece of instrument. I'm glad you didn't say like full blown sets, because we got vendors that'll support us on that with consignment and all kinds of different things. But the instruments, we're still buying a lot of those for shoulders and knees and whatever we need for that doctor to do the right procedure for the patient. But I think it takes too long. I think like if you're buying one piece at a time and you're trying to build a set over 6 months, and you know that doctor's coming in 6 months, absolutely, that's great planning. Nice job. Built your set. Here it is. This is what that surgeon was trained on. This was his fellowship, and now you have him what he needs to perform effectively. But a lot of times, that's so important for the case. It's almost part of. I come back to the recruiting piece. I'm such a believer with new surgeons coming in, new cath lab physicians coming in, whatever that surgeon looks like and what they need. It's got to be part of the recruitment process, and it's got to be that upfront cost that's part of the recruiting process to make sure they have all the tools they need. I really cringe when I hear like you're having to piecemeal things together to get effective care, effective surgery, effective outcomes, or you're not even ready to use the set till you've built it, right? So I lean on those vendors a lot of times too. Like those vendors, hey, the situation. I mean, their creativity, they can come in. There's some really, really good vendors out there and some really good partnerships, and they're not transactional, and they're really, really good in the OR. So I think just having that dialogue, I'm finding a lot different options on not just buying. There might be a lease. There might be disposables tied to that, or there might be another option. But I think the creativity, not only during our time frame, is internal to the OR and supply chain and the hospitals, but there's a lot more creativity out in our vendor community too, and they're supporting it.
I've seen it, where like a repair exchange upgrade it goes on the repair budget. It's technically a capital expense in many cases, but because you were going to spend in the territory of capital on the repair, then you say, well, wait a second, though, this is an older model. We can do a repair exchange upgrade and get something newer. I've also seen a lot of interesting lease programs. Yeah. So then what they're able to do financially is look at cost per procedure because of the way that they're billing for it, instead of, hey, we're going to spend this big amount of money up front and then we're going to depreciate the value of the asset. And sometimes the lease program isn't better for them financially, except for the fact that they don't really want to have that capital outlay up front. And so then this program kind of fits into some interesting business analytics for the operating room with, like, again, being able to look at it as a cost per procedure instead.
Agreed. I was just going to say, another thing too is if hospital systems or even a regional hospital, say you have 10 different hospitals, if they hadn't started looking at it as a system as a whole, I hope they're doing it now, because that capital outlay, I've been in a number of different systems where I've been in there and I've found somebody's not using something somewhere else, like that set you're talking about building, Melanie. They were doing the same thing, 2 hours north or 2 hours west in another facility that's part of that system. And there wasn't that coordination at a system-wide level. The silo, I think is sometimes difficult to put that together. But I've even seen these critical access hospitals that do minimal procedures. Like they're doing scopes, and there's a lot of capital there. But if they're in a really small geographical area, all these critical access hospitals have a doctor that's rotating, why wouldn't the vendor support that to move, to go get it taken care of? I mean, I think there's options and opportunities to look at it from a whole versus a silo here and there. And I'm seeing organizations actually work together a lot more than they did in the past. If you learn anything from the pandemic, I mean, we have a lot of leftover stock that we can share from a supply chain perspective that I'm seeing everybody's redistributing. And like, we've got 10 years worth of this. So how about you take this and I'll share this, and what are you low on? And I think the coordination and the collaboration is really increased within supply chain and also with the SMEs within the OR. I think we really have turned that up a notch where maybe we didn't have to worry about it so much before. I love seeing that. That collaboration is huge because, as Justin knows, it's all about the mission. It's all about the patient for me, always, all day long.
Absolutely. I want to shift gears just a little bit and kind of bring up, if anything, hospital systems and big centers and whatnot, they have lots of committees. Lots of people like to meet. And one of those is your capital budget committee. But all of us in the operating room aren't necessarily familiar with what that is, or who maybe is on that committee, or even what role we might play in bringing information to the people that are representing us in this committee so that we can push for the equipment that we need. So can you talk a little bit about those capital budget committees and maybe who's involved and what they do?
Sure. And I think, at a fault, I think I assume so much that like you're there at the table, you're there, and it becomes such a behind the doors, like C-suite, like making all the decisions, like who should truly be there. And I think that a transparency is a big deal. And in my experience, what I've seen, it's, typically been the CFO. It's typically been the CNO. It's been supply chain sometimes has a seat at the table. Sometimes they don't. There's all these different individuals that need to be there when you start talking about capital budgeting. But I think if the request comes out in the huddles, like there's a lot of morning huddles that go down to the OR or even to your guys' huddles. You have it the first morning, you have that talk of like capital budgeting is starting. It's going to be the calendar year, fiscal year starts January 1. We're starting it in August. What are your needs? And you start putting together your wish list. I mean, versus break fix and your wish list. And if you're a manager, you get it to your director. If there's not a director and as the next level is your CNO, you make sure you set up those meetings to tell them what you need and what you're needing for your patients to move forward. And so I think getting the right information to the right individual, knowing who's on that committee, I think is key. And why not have supply chain be a part of that too? I mean, they're your key to go out and get your dollars. They're going to negotiate. They're hopefully going to get you a service agreement with whatever kind of capital for hopefully 1 or more years past the OEM. But there's all these bits and pieces that I think are, if you've got it all together, this is what I need, and you've talked to the right people, how can they say no? There's got to be a process. There's got to be a policy. And I would just hope you get it in the right hands of the right individual at the time. So in my mind, it's getting it to your CNO. It's getting some time with your CFO. Melanie, what's wrong with reaching out to your CFO and say, can I get 30 minutes of your time on Friday morning at 7:30 over coffee? What's wrong with that? And if that's not overstepping bounds, obviously there's chain of command. But I think just sharing your case, and you never can go wrong with mission. You're speaking for the patient. You're always speaking for the patient. And it gives me goosebumps. How can anybody say that you're not doing the right thing when you do that? Because I've seen it where it's been siloed. I remember walking the floors as a chief resource officer and finding out capital. People needed bladder scanners. People needed certain things on the floors. I'm like, how are you not getting these? And they're like, I haven't heard of them in the capital deal. So I was making my floors and bringing it back. It's just getting in front of the right audience to share your case and making that time and having your ducks in a row to understand what the need is, I think it is a great start. As a manager, I'm thinking about a manager, or you're that person in the OR. So,
sure.
And also to not make the relationship adversarial, right, Gary? Like, to figure out how you can foster a positive communication channel so that maybe you get sort of the answers to some of those questions. Because let's keep this in mind. Whatever that approval process was yesterday, it may be different tomorrow. Whatever the state of that healthcare system that you were successful in making a request a year ago may not be the same today. There's turnover going on all over healthcare. So a lot of times the people who are sort of leading those processes or approving those budgets, et cetera, they're changing too. And they may have different priorities. The organization may have led them in different directions. So, you know, Gary, I know we're bumping up on time, but, you know, as somebody who even worked as a vendor, I'm not even sure which perspective this comes, you know, best for you to kind of put a bow on that last, you know, conversation. But with that turnover and strategic changes, et cetera, like, was that frustrating at times? Like, do you think that there are clinicians out there or clinical leaders that sometimes just say, look, my job is to deliver patient care. I can't keep up with the business aspects of this. Who can support me? Is that something that you run into commonly? And as a resource officer, how did you try to make sure that wasn't their experience?
Yeah, I just tried to be a liaison. I mean, I really, by getting out of my office and walking down to the cath lab or walking down to the OR, you heard what they needed and just being a liaison to support them. But I think you're right, Justin. The venue of how it's changed. I mean, you can probably go on your intranet within that hospital system or that hospital and find out how to maybe ask for capital equipment, but that's maybe changed. I mean, there's so many different town hall meetings with your CEO. I mean, those things come up. Ask the question. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with asking the question. Is the process for capital the same? Who do I go to? What are my steps? Play the new card. I think it's a fair answer, but supply chain is a great liaison to do that because we are held accountable to watch the dollars coming in, even some labor costs, but primarily all the non-labor dollars coming in. That is our line with the CFO. So I think we're great liaisons to help support you get it to the table. And I think it's a great partnership to work with, maybe where they don't have a seat at the C-suite, but they can get it there as well. Justin, if that makes sense.
In thinking of just the capital equipment discussion and remembering all of the different things that I had to go through as a team leader, as an OR manager, to get my requests heard and to get them in front of the right people. At a smaller facility, it was a little easier because I knew everybody and I could just walk right into their office and be like, sup, I need this, and get it for me. But in a bigger facility, academic medical center, you can't do that. It doesn't work that way. But what I found was the most helpful is if I got down into the details and I would go work with my vendor on, in orthopedics, we have these big specialty tables, these things that cost so much money.
Yep.
And
yeah,
exactly.
Yep.
And they're looking at it, going, well, you have a table. Why are we even talking about another one? Why are we talking about a new one? And I'm like, okay, yes, we have one, but it's reaching end of life. How are we going to maintain this table after a certain time? And so having all of my ducks in a row, having all that information, and letting them add that to the capital wish list for 5 years from now or 4 years from now, but going ahead and putting it on their radar and saying, hey, we're going to need this. It's going to hit end of life. We are going to need to replace it. Suddenly it wasn't like they were blindsided the year of when suddenly we didn't have it anymore, but they had already known, they knew it was coming. And then I could really present my case for why I needed something. And that kind of information would help with my CFO and with other people in those committees understanding why we needed it. And then also always falling back on patient safety. Is this a patient safety issue? Is it going to affect our patient care? And if it is, here's why we need something and why we might need it now. And those were ways that as a clinical person, I would get heard in the non-clinical maybe meeting with everybody in the room. And that would help me get what I needed for the operating room.
That's huge, Melanie. And then you just made me think of an example that we did too. We had a meeting before the meeting. We were running into the same issue, like you weren't being supported like that. We built a subgroup like separately, and it was clinical engineering, biomed, IT, IS, how many times is there a component of that? Supply chain, and then facilities. Because sometimes you can't get a bariatric chair through a door at a clinic because no one thought about it.
Or you buy a robot and you can't get it into the OR, but that's another story.
or through the elevator. It won't go on the elevator, down. I mean, you can't. Those are really good points. But we brought those 4 individuals just together. I'm like, Melanie, come tell us about what you need. And we'd be like, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about this?
So
have you thought about this? And it was amazing because it helped, like you learned and you grew and you understood it. And then we knew it was potentially coming up. So they were prepared. So these were all good pieces. And we built this subgroup with 4 guys, and it was so successful at our location and where we were at. Because those are kind of the 4 main people within that capital area to support you, because everybody thinks about the piece of equipment and like, oh my gosh, there's an IT component. And then there's like we talked about, there's so many other bits and pieces of it down that are cost.
Yeah. No or the impact that new equipment in the operating room has on sterile processing. And we don't even think about,
oh my gosh, the room.
The washers, the instruments don't fit, those kinds of things.
The Operation X, the OpEx. I mean, how much time and is it going to take to run this through? And then the size of the OR. That robot takes up how much room in the OR? Oh, we got to move stuff. That's too big.
We can't get it in.
I'm so with you, Melanie. That's a whole nother. that's a whole other discussion. I love it. I love it. So yeah.
Yeah, that is a whole other conversation, but it is an important one around capital equipment because a lot of times it is large equipment. What a great fundamental way to bring all the different stakeholders to the table, because there's nothing worse than projecting revenue, as it might have related to the robot, like you were talking about, Melanie, projecting revenue, having a start date, getting that all built in, having already laid out the capital dollars, and then all of a sudden you can't, like you hit one of these snags that sets you back 3 months. That's a huge issue. And as we talked about, spending the money more efficiently and being able to do those things, a lot of times, especially as lean as healthcare is, it's really important to hit those targets, the way we expect to. And when we miss, it hurts everybody and the wellness financially of the organization. So, Gary, great job. Not that it's a surprise to me. We do this 32 times a year. Now you're at 33 because you've been a guest on First Case. But I think this is your second appearance, though, isn't it?
I think so. I think it was one of the early ones on just the relationship with supply chain and the OR.
That's
right. That was a lot of fun.
So
Melanie needs to come over to Power Supply now. I think it would be great.
There we go. I think that's a great idea. And I will say this. We've got a few repeat guests coming on this season, including yourself, Gary. You're kicking it off. That just tells you how many episodes we put in the books, Melanie. So, hey, great family of podcasts. Gary, thanks for being part of the family and giving your time here on First Case today and your insights on, the supply chain and the business aspects of capital equipment that impact the operating room.
No, it's been great. Melanie, it's been a pleasure. It's been a lot of fun with you, too. I get to see Justin's face all the time, so it's great to visit with you as well.
Unfortunate for you.
It's all good. It's all good.
Gary Skinner, everybody, partner at Discover S3 and co-host of the Power Supply podcast with myself and Melanie. I think this is a really great podcast as we kick off this season because I don't think a lot of people, especially on the front lines, really understand how all this budgeting works. And actually, as we talked about some of the performance metrics that people hear about all the time in the operating room, I think people loosely know that it's tied to how we perform financially and, how much revenue that a hospital can bring in. But just to put something on here, lately, over the last year, and I saw something recently, but hospitals have been operating on negative margins, which means they're losing money. And so, if you're wondering why the purse strings might be a little tight, that certainly has something to do with it. But the more efficiently we run, the more revenue comes in, which means there's more money available for capital purchases, upgrades, etc. I think Gary did such a nice job of talking about sort of how we navigate that and maybe some best practices, not just for the operating room, but in collaboration with all these other stakeholders that may very much be involved.
Yeah, I think you really did a good job talking about building those relationships with the other departments and recognizing that we all need to be working together to get the equipment that we need, and making sure that supply chain or facilities or IT, those different departments aren't left out of the conversation, because they all have to come to the table in order for us to actually make complete purchases or get what we need. And I really think it's helpful to have a conversation just about capital budgets, because frontline staff, we don't know necessarily what goes into that. We just know that we're frustrated because we don't have the equipment that we need, or we keep being told it's not been approved, or we keep waiting, but we haven't seen it. And then maybe all of a sudden something else gets purchased out of the blue, and we're like, well, we know how much that costs. Why do we have this? And we don't have what we've been asking for 2 years. And so to see maybe the inner workings of how the capital budgeting process works, I think is very helpful, because when you understand why something works the way it does, it can help you understand the process and maybe give you an exposure to the bigger picture of what's going on outside of just our department. So Gary just did a really good job really breaking that down for everybody.
Yeah, Gary does a nice job on the Power Supply podcast. So if there's anybody out there who has sort of a dual role, value analysis is a great one. Lots of clinicians involved in value analysis. Certainly check out the Power Supply podcast as well. That is a wrap for this show, but I do want to remind everybody to download our smartphone app for iPhone or Android. It's my favorite way to listen to the podcast. I'm sure it's yours, Melanie. And if you're already listening to podcasts and you'd rather find us on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts, we're there, as well as Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify. And really, you can just search for the First Case Podcast on your favorite podcast application. We'd love to get your feedback, and you can do that. The best way is to reach out to Melanie and I on LinkedIn, or share our posts on LinkedIn from the First Case channel. Send us a message or an email, info@firstcasemedia.com. We'd love to hear from you. And that's going to do it for this week's episode. Thanks, everybody, on behalf of Melanie and myself, for listening to this episode of First Case.